This is Carl again on Tabletop Tango, your tabletop role-playing cast that tries to do deep dives on a variety of topics. Today I am not with my co-host Eric because I'm going to be doing a deep dive into, I don't know if it's a deep dive, but it's an introduction to scripting in Roll20. For those who are watching this video, I would assume you already know what the API and scripting is because you want to learn about it, but it goes beyond the typical macros you'll find in Roll20 and allows you to do some really detailed work, affecting tokens, affecting the environment, and doing, animations, whatnot. And so I wanted to go ahead and do something because I've been working on it a lot and give you kind of an input or give you a chance to learn a bit about it. So let me go ahead and bring up our pages here and start out. So you can start by finding a lot of the information, or at least introduction to it, through your help page here on Roll20. And down here in the Roll20 API content, there's an introduction, there's some user guide. It's really kind of basic and it starts you off. And I found that when I was starting off, it really wasn't enough information. And so I dug into the existing scripts, I learned more about them, and I went from there. So let's start by thinking about what kind of script we want to make. And we're going to try to do something that's useful and real, and based on sort of something you might want to do, but it'll still be simple. So one of the things I find that is something I'd like to do more is to select a number of tokens and make some changes on them. And that's not possible today. For status markers, you have to go into each individual and make those changes yourself. You can't do them all at the same time. So if I select them all, there's no way to make a change. So, what if your characters cast a fireball and everybody's dead? So I want to make a script that makes everybody dead at the same time, does this incapacitation every time. So how would I do that? Well, so let's start by looking at sort of a template or a best practice that we can use to make our scripts. In the documentation, they show some very simple setups, and those are great for simple things, but you'll look that there's a pattern that you'll find in most of the heavy-duty scripts that are out on the script API portal. And so let's look at that and use that as our baseline so that we can, leverage sort of that best practice. So I already have my function put because I was a little bit worried that it'd be hard to type it all in while we were doing this. So the structure of this sort of template or, pattern is we have our script, whatever we want to call it, and I'm going to call mine makeemdead.javascript. And I'll make sure the script is available and there's a link to it so that you can look at it and kind of decompose it or dig into it yourself. And then we set up some basic version information, and then we have a set of functions. And I'll go through these functions each step of the way. But what's important is right at the end here, we define our first event, and that's one of the key things you'll find in Roll20 API is it executes on events. And so if our one event is on ready, and that says whenever the campaign is up and going, what should we do? And in this case, again, this template, we take this variable we created, which has all our functions and all our content in it, and we call our check install, and then we register our event handlers. And registering event handlers is kind of a standard programming practice. You define your callbacks and your events that way. So let's go real quick and take a look at the events. So in the documentation, there's a set of events that are defined. And so it's triggered by the on function, and that's on in a variety of things. And usually it's like change a graphic element. And by the way, a token is a graphic element. So change graphic would trigger should something change on your element. Now we are going to build something where we're getting commands. And so we're saying, hey, I need you to go make all these things dead. And so what we're going to do there is the event we're going to use is a chat event So anything typed in the chat window triggers a chat event. And so let's take a look at our chat event. And so that one is on chat message. So as we get a message, we pass in this message and we can do some work. And the message content is here. And who did it, the content of the message, etc. And so that becomes our, when we talk about registering event handlers, that's the event handler we're registering, this function here. Because we want to deal with the input. And so part of the standard pattern is to have a function called handle input. And so I create this handle input function. Now you'll see, if you're not familiar with JavaScript or you're got some limited, this seems kind of weird the way we're defining that. But again, variables can hold functions. And so what we're doing is we're creating a bunch of variables which are functions. So you see the comma, and we're creating these check install, create another function. And so you'll see these commas after each one. And that's a problem you'll run into if you're not careful. You'll have, these failures and things break on you because you've forgotten a comma, and that's a hard one to diagnose if you're not thinking about it. So, so our function handler then is handle input. So what did we do? We did our check install. And then now all I'm doing is logging the version and information about it. But you'll see if you dig into scripts, some people are checking to make sure that the state data they stored is now compatible, what have you. And then, so now we've got our handle input. And so we get that message, and I showed that a little briefly. And the key thing from the message, couple of key things, is we have to first check the type. It has to be an API. If it's not an API, then it's obviously not a command. We don't do anything with it. Next thing we do is we take that message.content, and then we're going to split it into a set of arguments, and that's split by a blank. So basically we have command space parameter, and we're splitting that up. And so for my function, what I'm doing is I get that list of arguments, I get this pattern, and you can just reuse this as is, as long as this is useful to you. And so then we look for our function name. And so I define my function or my script name as make'emdead. The exclamation point is important because that comes along, and that's how you execute a script from the chat window or from a macro. But we have to look for that. It doesn't get stripped off. So make'emdead. If that's that, then that's us. We need to do our work. And so then we get our parameter. We shift the arguments again, so we get the next parameter. And if it's help, we'll display some help. If it's to do it, that means, hey, do what we need to do and make it happen. Now, normal best practice in programming is we wouldn't put all that logic in the same spot. We're going to create a function. And so again, comma, here's a new function we've defined. And we're going to execute. And so what gets passed in, or what I'm passing in, is message selected. So if we go back to our message, selected is array of objects that the user has selected. So when I get into my application or my game and I run the script and I've got a couple of things selected, both these tokens will get passed in, and I'll get this as part of a list. And so as I'm working on that, I can say, I'll get that list, I passed it in, and then we do a bunch of work. And here's, a little bit of complexity that let me explain a bit how that works. So one of the things that is available in the API is something called, let me pull it up real quick so you can actually see it, is something that uses the library _.js. And _.js has a large number of useful functions that are available, that are invoked by, underscore dot the function name. What we're going to leverage is something that the utility provides, which is called chaining. And chaining, in a nutshell, we don't have to get totally into it, is a way of, we take a object, it gets wrapped, it keeps getting passed from function to function to function that's tied together. And, basically, it's almost like a pipeline. I get a array, or I get that objects, I do something to them, I look at them, I filter them, I sort them, what have you, and then I pass it to the next part of the chain, the next part of the pipeline. And at the end, something pops out. And so we're going to leverage that. And so this is a very, very, very useful piece that I want to show you guys. And this is something that you'll use all the time if you're looking at selections, or you'll have a group of things. And so let's take a look. So first we do chain, and we're chaining on the tokens. And again, that tokens is a list of everything. And so in the function, we pass that first list item. And now what we're going to do is we're actually going to get the object that represents that token. So let's take a look at that in the API. So in the API, it shows you the set of objects. What we're looking at, again, is a graphic. So we're looking at it for tokens. And so there's a unique ID, and there's a unique type defined as graphic. And here's all the things that you can access within that object. And you'll see, if you play around with the tokens, look at them from the UI, you'll see that this is all the stuff that's there that you can access. Now we're going to change a status marker from nothing to them being dead with that incapacitation X. And so how am I going to do that? Well, that information's obviously stored in here, and it's called status markers. And in status markers, you get a comma delimited list of the current active status markers. And they're even nice enough down here later to just show you them all. And this is in the same order as you'll see them in the UI. So you can count down and get it. It'd be nice if they had that laid out with the graphic and then the text. But what we're trying to do is we're trying to do that red X, which is dead. So that's the marker we're looking for to change. Okay, get back to the kind of main. I'm getting ahead of myself a little bit. So first thing is we get that object. So now we have an object, a graphic object. The next thing we pass to is a filter. And again, you can look at this in the underscore JS library, what exactly it does. But essentially what we're doing is we're going to return true or false if we get the subtype, and that's part of the object. And the subtype we're looking for is token. So if this is something other than a token, we don't want to deal with it. So we're going to filter that out so that when we get to our each function, which iterates through each of these objects, we're already done. We don't have to worry about checking if it's a token. So now what are we going to do? So now we've got an individual token, and this is where we're doing the majority of the work for our script. So now we want to get that information from the object. So now we're going to go get, and we're going to get that status markers filled. So you can see for getting any one of these pieces, we're going to use the object.get function, and then that gets this piece of it once we have the object. And we got the object by doing a get object by providing a type and that ID. And we got that from our list of tokens that got passed in. Okay? Makes sense? And so now we have the status markers. We have the list. Now, probably proper programming practice would be to parse that list because it's comma delimited into maybe an array, processed array, and then spit it back out as a token delimited list, comma delimited list. And there's functions to do that in JavaScript, and there's everything is easy. You can do it. It's as an example. So I'm going to go a real brain dead approach. So basically, what I'm going to do is I'm going to check to see if our string has dead in it. If it doesn't have dead, I'm going to kind of tack that on with a comma. Again, it's a comma delimited list. And honestly, if you got an extra comma in there, it ignores the null commas. So if I've got a comma in the beginning and nothing in front, it's fine with it. If you got a comma in the middle, it's fine with it. I've played with it a lot, and it doesn't seem to be all that dissatisfied with what I do there. So we look and we say if there's not a dead, and that's the index of is a JavaScript function that says where in the string is this character or this string within this main string. So what's this? And if you find it, you get a number back from 0 to wherever its position is. If you don't, -1. So I say new status. I'm going to create the status string plus this comma, dead. All right, so I didn't find it. So now I'm pretty much done with what I'm trying to do, but to make it a little more fun, if they're already dead, else if I found it, then I'm actually going to replace the dead with nothing, and that will turn that off. So I can I'm literally toggling it as opposed to just making them dead. And then I've got this little hack thing here, which is if I've pulled dead out from the middle, I'll have 2 commas together, and I'll go replace that with 1 comma. Again, this is probably a little hacky way of doing it, but I've done it in 4 lines instead of iterating over an array and what have you, and it seems to work fine. And so then at the end, now we have to get that object with the new changes. And so what I do here is I'm creating another, a object that includes that name. Again, we go back to our object, and here's all those names. Status marker is the name, and we're going to change that to new status list, which is the one we made, and then we set. So here we get them, here we set them. And so now we've made that change. And that's what this function does. And again, it iterates using the chain over every one of the tokens that I've selected. If I haven't selected a token, it just doesn't do anything. If I've selected 1 token, it just does the 1 token. If I select 5 tokens, it does the 5 tokens. And so to finish it off, here's that display help that you can also have. So that's kind of the standard pattern. We define the onReady, which says, hey, the campaign started up. We call our check install. In my case, it just displays the version. And then we register our handlers. We register chat message. Now, if you wanted to react to a change to an item and not the chat message, you change this. But the pattern stays the same. We have a handle input. Handle input brings in the parameters, checks them, calls our function that does the work. And in our function that does the work, if we're acting on more than one thing, we leverage this chain command. So now how do we get this in to Roll20 to actually test it and use it? So when you're in the, and I left that out. I should not have done that. So let me go ahead and so I'm doing this on the dev server. You don't have to. You can do it on the regular server. You just have to have a pro account. So on the dev server, I've got you would create or as part of one of your games, you'd have a game. And when we look at our game, under settings, we can bring up the API script panel. And so I've already done that because, again, I didn't want anything to go bad. And so you already have, so we have the script panel. And if it's new, you'll have it empty. Or you'll have the scripts you've already installed. And what we're going to do is we do a new script. And then the new script has the name of utility, and you can put your functions in. We are already created a new script. I typed in the name make 'em dead, which is what I named my script. And again, I use that name is identical to the name of the variable I create. And I just keep that consistent all the way across just to keep my sanity. And so this is where we'd enter our script. Now, what I think is a best practice is we don't ever edit in this panel. Not even making tweaks. You go, hey, here's a little problem. I'm going to make a tweak. Because I ran into an issue. Then everything gets out of sync. I would do everything in my editor and then just copy and paste every time I'm testing. So in my editor, I select everything, I copy, and then I would go over to my script panel. I'd go in here, I'd go all delete and then paste. And then I'd have it ready to rock and roll. And then once I'm done, I save the script. And you can see what it does is restart, fires up. It called my check status. It dumped out my execution. And so then if we're in the game, and I can find my game. So now I'm back in the game. I called this, I can't remember what I called it. So what did I call my function? Make 'em dead. All right, so we got make 'em dead. So we got our make 'em dead. And then if we remember, there was the do it command. Ta-da! And it worked. And then if we, now a little quirky thing about Roll20 is it unselects, if you have multiple selections, it unselects them. So that's kind of annoying, but, and then we can undo it. If we do it for 1, it works just the same. If we select nothing, no problem, just didn't do anything. And so you notice I had a lot of log messages And so what we can do is see what's going on under the covers a little bit as things get passed around, just for fun. You know, sometimes it's nice to know the details. And so when we fire it up, in there, I say, here's what all the objects I got in that content. So I print out the content so you can see what it is. And so here's the ID, that unique ID. Here's the type graphic. Here's the type graphic. And so remember, we use that to do our copy and catch. And then our original status, we didn't have anything, so we didn't find dead. We added dead. We added dead. And so those were the two that I selected, and that's what's going on underneath the covers. Now that previous one, when we already had things selected, or already had that yellow status, that one had a yellow status, and if we looked, when we looked in here, oh, sorry, getting confused. When we looked at that one, we already had the yellow spanner, and they were dead. And then when we ran it, and we said, you can see that we added the dead, that previous one. But it was one graphic that was selected. Here was one we selected none, and it didn't do anything, and it didn't crash, and it worked perfectly fine. So that's kind of the baseline of creating a useful script, something that does some work. Again, let's go over, you know, the basics are, we got this basic template pattern to handle everything. The big important function is the chain, so that we can act on a list of things. And I think that's important. It's really useful to, and I'll reiterate, I mean, you can write scripts that handle a token. So I want to move a token left. I want to move a token right when I call this thing, or I want to do something else to it. Perfectly okay. And you can keep it simple. But if you want to make it really interesting, you want to let people select a number of tokens and execute your script on them. And it makes it just that much more valuable. So we remember the chain, we understand it help. We'll have a little help function. And then if you want to have multiple event handlers, and I, you know, obviously could do a video later on some of those event handlers. But for now, this is just reacting to the chat message. And this is a good template to use to do baseline. So we created something that did real work. We looked at objects. We looked at the underscore API, a good thing to review and look at. We looked at our object for our graphic tokens that we can interact with. All of this is available through the main page. There's an introduction, a user guide. I didn't find the basic examples and some of the advanced. I didn't find them all that useful. I would go to the scripts. Once you get comfortable, and hopefully this video made you a little more comfortable, you can jump into some of the scripts and start looking at how they do things. If you're not an expert in JavaScript, it may seem like Greek, so maybe a friend can help you with that if you're doing anything really, really complicated. But totally brain dead to execute a command, do some work, change your object, especially a token that you're working with. It's really easy to also react to other events, and maybe we'll look at that later. So anyway, this was a basic look at scripting. I hope it was useful, and that is all for now. Thank you.